We have a chance now to hear from two women in business leadership. And you have their bios before you, so I will be somewhat brief. But I'm very pleased to have this chance to talk with both of them and invite them each to give some initial remarks, and then we'll have a conversation and perhaps, if time permits, open it up for a question or two if you're willing. And so Patricia, I will not pronounce your well. Armendariz. Has just had an extraordinary career in finance and banking, and she has been the CEO and principal shareholder of a major financial institution that is aimed at supporting microfinance entrepreneurs. She was an advisor to the Minister of Finance. She was involved in the advising on the financial services portion of NAFTA, so you may have views on NAFTA 2, as we sometimes call it. She was an advisor to the National Banking Commission, and later the associated director of the BIS. And so I think with a PhD in economics from Columbia University, as well as a master's in economics, and extensive lifelong experience in the financial sector, very grateful to have you with us. Thank you very much. And I'm very pleased to also welcome Sandra Navi Dee, who is the founder and CEO of Beyond Global, a consulting firm where she has been very, very visible around the world, offering macroeconomic and strategic advice. I first came to know of her when she was working as an economist with Nouriel Roubini, and earlier to that was an investment banker and a consultant at Deloitte. And she's written a book called Super Hubs: How the Financial Elite and Their Networks Rule the World, which has been very successful. It came out last year, which I hope you'll say more about. So let me invite each of our speakers to say a few words, and then we'll move into a discussion. Let me invite Patricia to lead us off.
Thank you. Well, first of all, I would like to express my gratitude to Professor Phelps, our longtime friend and mentor, for having the opportunity to empower us and to empower me in particular to be among these great, great women around the world. I would like to reflect upon this subject from my own point of view and my own experience as an entrepreneur myself. I think that entrepreneurship has been seen broadly associated with increasing equality across socioeconomic and demographic groups in society. In fact, the World Economic Forum has included conditions allowing entrepreneurship to flourish as necessary for inclusive growth. I, together with others, suggest that this entrepreneurship's potential to close gaps should also include the gender gap in the marketplace between men and women. It has been observed that an entrepreneurial opportunity has provided women the possibility to overcome the so-called glass ceiling that prevents them to grow further in the corporate labor market. However, the empirical observations of differences between men and women entrepreneurs may suggest that entrepreneurship may not be a good gender equalizer. On one hand, women entrepreneurs are more associated with low-growth, low-income businesses relative to men's association to high-growth, more scalable ones. On the other hand, women entrepreneurs have lower access to financial resources for their companies and pay relatively higher prices for the resources they obtain. Therefore, this is consistent with the observation of women entrepreneurs associated to companies with relatively smaller assets, such as the retail and service sector. In theory, women compensate for this lack of opportunities for funding using their relatively larger capacities for networking through personal relationships for funding access. As investors which is also my experience, women tend to invest in family businesses and tend to mentor more along their growth compared to men. Apparently, therefore, the inequality of gender observations in the labor market seem to be translated into the business owner sector in terms of income and growth opportunities. Previous work experience in the entrepreneurial areas where women try to embark is a factor more associated with entrepreneurial choice of women relative to men's. Our previous experience is a factor. So, why should we be surprised that women entrepreneurs are associated with low growth industries and companies when there is an association of women's relatively higher acceptance in the service and retail sectors in the labor market, where they acquire their experience? If the barriers observed in the labor market regarding high growth segments' acceptance of women do not change, neither we cannot see entrepreneurship as a gender equalizer. Perhaps an alternative explanation of these stylized facts may lay in trying to understand the reason why previous work experience in the sector is a factor for women choosing to jump into the entrepreneurial opportunities. And it has to do with risk aversion, difference through age and gender. I think there are gender differences regarding our attitudes toward risk-taking. On the one hand, whereas entrepreneurship is seen as a way out to avoid women's impediments to advance in the corporate world, women enter the entrepreneurial world at a later age than men. And risk aversion increases with age. This is why we choose to embark in entrepreneurial activities where we have previous experience to avoid the number of falls associated with trial and error in activities we know nothing about. But also I think risk aversion per se is a gender differentiator. And it has to do with our perceived role in society, where taking care of our children for once makes us look for more stable paths in terms of income relative to men, even in the type of companies we choose to start as entrepreneurs. Our perception of what quality of life means is another gender differentiator in general, I think. Whereas men may perceive financial success as a central tenet of their perception of achievement, entrepreneurship for women is a way of having independence to balance their achievements in a more diversified array, not only financial. This could explain the observed gender differences of women associated with low growth, low income industries vis-à-vis men, since this type of industries allows them to have freedom for other types of achievements in their life, such as mentoring their children or even taking care of their parents. Apparently, the rate of survival of women's business is lower also relative to those led by men. But I think this has to do more with, again, risk attitudes towards across genders. Whereas men are associated with starting up in many ideas, women embark in pursuing only one, and statistically, 1 in 10 startups survive in general. Does that make us women entrepreneurs of a lesser kind? After all, risk-taking and entrepreneurship go hand in hand, and business scalability is associated with quality of enterprises. I think high risk, high variance applies to gender differences. Women lead business in the same way that the risk tolerance behaves. Businesses that, when they succeed, show stable, vigorous growth through the years. My own story, if you may allow me, is consistent with my previous reflections. Having acquired a strong background and experience in banking as a regulator, my entry into the private income earning sector was a big bank. My aspirations of leading that bank soon disappeared by my boss's perception of women's inadequacy as senior bankers. It is my experience that in a male-dominated world, such as banking, men feel uncomfortable taking peer-to-peer decisions with an alien woman whose morals and drivers and ultimately world perception is different. At least this is true for my generation. Once I realized there was indeed a glass ceiling, therefore I initiated my road to entrepreneurship in what I knew how to do, banking. In the beginning, I started small and perceived that a good, stable path had to be one of slow, prudent growth. In the new arena of startups all over the world, as I said before, scalability is a must for investors. And they did not see my scalability anywhere because I was not a financial technology bank, fintechs, as they call them. And I did not want to also because it was an unknown field to me, and failure and trial and error was not an option at my age. Thus, high funding was not available for me. However, my previous experience gave me access to funds through networking in banks that previously knew me. This provided me with a strong platform of institutional funding, allowing me to get a size and history of profits enough for the next stage, where funding now is available at the quantities that I may need according to the growth path that I have considered as adequate. As the only woman investor in Shark Tank Mexico, the types of investments that attract me are definitely different from the rest of my colleagues. Whereas they go for potentially high scalable projects, I tend to favor small businesses with lower growth outlooks. After the investments where my colleagues just invest and let the entrepreneurs take his or her decision, I make sure they are ready to get the investment and mentor them a lot. But this is a story consistent with my generation, and so are the statistics. Things are changing at a high speed, including gender preferences. Women millennials enter the entrepreneurial world at the same age as men with no previous experience. They embark in high speed, high risk, high variance, multiple initiatives, just like men. Their revealed preferences may tell a different story than mine, both in their perceived role in society and their own definitions of achievement. At least their decision to bear children is postponed relative to my generation, and their perceived uncertainty as a family with a long-time partner has changed their own perception of what they need to become capable members of a society. In this changing scenario, the increasingly complex and vibrant world of entrepreneurs is indeed a level playing field. As a final remark, it has been shown that access to finance is a more important driver for women in starting their own companies. Therefore, financial availability for entrepreneurs in general could be a good inclusion mechanism for women entrepreneurs. Thank you.
Thank you. May I invite Sandra?
I would like to thank Professor Phelps, his great team, Dean Jano, and Columbia University for having me, and for all of you taking an interest into this subject, which is very near to my heart and that I feel strongly about. Women who don't ask for raises create good karma for themselves. Those are the types of women I would trust and I would give greater responsibility to. Those words were not spoken in the 50s. Those words were not spoken by some provincial owner of a ma and pa shop. Those words were spoken in 2014 by the CEO of Microsoft, Satya Nadella. His views may be more extreme than the average CEO's, but I think they're somewhat emblematic of an inherent bias and prejudices that have been ingrained over centuries. I stumbled over this quote while I was writing my book. I wrote a book about the financial industry, and I explained it with network science, and I focused particularly at people at the top. I looked at it as a human system. And after a while, I realized that I was only writing about men. There were no women, and I had to somehow explain why that is. And it quickly turned out, and I mean, that's a whole nother subject, but that it's an effect of network dynamics, and if we don't disrupt these dynamics, these inequalities and imbalances will become more and more ingrained. Women are grossly underrepresented in the highest ranks of the corporate world, despite a clear business case in their favor. This is something also I don't have the time to go into now, but there is a wealth of research corroborating and substantiating that diverse environments, and including women creates better business results. When I wrote the book, and the same year that the quote is from, that was 2014, only 5% of Fortune 500 companies had a female CEO, and now, 5 years later, it's the exact same number. As a matter of fact, at the time, I was looking how many financial institutions were led by women, and in the US there was one. That was Abigail Johnson of Fidelity, because her father retired, and one in Europe, that was Ana Botín of Santander, because her father had passed away. So there were 2 women because of their fathers. So there are so many reasons why there are few women at the very top echelon of the corporate world, and one of it is, of course, that women are still the child bearers and they face logistical constraints, because research has demonstrated that they are still, even with the most progressive husbands, the primary caregivers, and they still bear the brunt of housework. But then there is a more insidious issue, and that is the biases and prejudices that still exist. Women are still constrained by ancient social values and perceptions, and masculine behavioral norms do not apply to them. There are endless examples, but for instance, let's take ambition. Ambition is generally viewed as something positive in men, but not in women, because it implies aggression, which is reserved for men. The societal stereotype is still that women should be kind and considerate and caring. Another example is when men talk at length, they're considered as more competent. When women do the same, they are perceived as less competent by both men and women. There's a tendency to expect help from a woman, whereas help from a man is rewarded. Men tend to engage in more visible workplace behaviors or activities, whereas women, do the kind of office housework, time-consuming administrative tasks that they don't get any credit for, and so they get less attention for that. Worse, women suffer from poor confidence. When they're successful, they often feel lucky, or worse, as imposters. In contrast to men, when they're successful, they usually think it's very well deserved. One reason for that may be, as a McKinsey study has shown, that men are judged on performance, the other way around. Men are judged on their potential and women on their actual performance. Also, a Harvard study has shown that women are judged more harshly. For instance, if they leave work early, their colleagues, both men and women, assume that she probably has to do something family-related, whereas when men leave early, they think, oh, he probably has a client engagement or something important. And that also leads to fewer opportunities for women, because if senior people assume that women are constrained by their families, for instance, travel opportunities are assigned to men. I'll focus a little bit on one specific angle, and that is networks and networking, only because I've done a lot of research on that for my book. And I think it's one of the key reasons why women are less visible and less successful in the highest ranks, because they are excluded from the predominantly male networks. Even if women make it to the more senior ranks in their late 40s, early 50s, they're typically not plugged into the information and power channels to the same extent that men are. You see that the higher the rank, at the entry level, it's more diverse, but the higher you get, the more homogeneous the environment becomes, and the more it's just male. And so, but if women are not part of these networks, they also miss out on network currencies. We are all part of networks, we're all nodes in networks, and then there are connections, pathways between those nodes, and that's where we exchange network currencies, such as information is a very important one. It's also capital, what Patricia referred to, and just generally opportunities. And if you are not part of this network, you, by definition, miss out on these opportunities. Also, because men are entrenched in these structures, that gives them more social capital. Over the years, they can build, doing favors and just hanging out with each other, and that gives them bargaining power and, again, more opportunities. It's kind of ironic because oftentimes women are exactly hired for their social skills, for their EQ, for their ability to form relationships. So they're often hired for, especially in finance, for client servicing, to acquire new clients, but they have not managed to use this skill for their own advantage to advance into the very senior ranks. It's just there are very long-standing, almost evolutionary patterns of network behavior that are very hard to break into. Another issue is that male employees tend to have better relationships with their superiors, and part of that reason is that they can more casually hang out with them and network. And it's very important in networking to form informal relationships. It's not just the formal, on the record, networking. It's also the hanging out in the office together, the going for drinks after work. And naturally, men can do that much more easily with each other, especially if it's a senior man with a junior woman. And in the Me Too age, they may be reluctant to do that. It may create gossip, even if it's very innocent. So women have an inherent disadvantage. Also, there are network dynamics like homophily and power laws, like and like attracts. Men just gravitate towards other younger men with whom they see themselves in them, they can relate to them, they can talk shorthand with them, they can just identify with them. And then a purely male senior management has very few incentive to advocate for women. A lot of this discrimination, should be said, is subconscious and unintentional, and I go more into the psychological effects and reasons for that in the book. And then also it's women, I write men at the very senior levels, contrary to what some may expect, have very high levels of EQ. They're very good at relationship building, they're very charming, also with each other. And women, because they always fear that they may be suspected of having advanced on the basis of their feminine charms, become more rigid. And I think that's something that I've observed with myself. You're very prim and proper, And actually, in my book, I wrote an example that, and that also goes to the previous point, that at a formal dinner, I was seated next to a bank CEO, who's very well known, shall remain unnamed. And when dinner was a little progressed and he had ingested a few glasses of wine, we had talked for a while, he said, "Gosh, you're so smart, but I could never hire you, or else everybody would think that we'd have an affair." And I wrote that, and then I wrote, "I was so embarrassed." And my German editor actually noted that and said, "Why are you embarrassed? He should be embarrassed." And he thought that was very stereotypical. Then it's argued that women lack role models, and also that they are still learning practices that men have long internalized. That sounds a little condescending. I wasn't sure if I should include that, and everything that I mentioned is substantiated by research. It's not my opinion, but I do have to say I have many qualifications, but what I get approached most about is networking and relationship building, also by people who are already very successful, and I get asked, I feel, surprisingly basic questions. So I think this is something that's very important, but something that's not taught at business schools or any schools for that matter. So what are the solutions? I think ultimately, and that's the hardest because it's intangible, it's immeasurable, is to change the culture and change biases, prejudices, and the zeitgeist. It can be done. We see with the Me Too movement, behaviors that were still considered normal in the 50s are now completely unacceptable. I think fora and platforms such as these can be very helpful, are very helpful as a platform to launch initiatives. And I think it's imperative to include women in leadership positions, because it has been shown if they're included in leadership positions, they will promote other women, more women. How do you do that? I used to be against quotas. In my home country in Germany, we didn't have quotas, and this has been a long-standing discussions. And what has happened over the last few years? Pretty much nothing. If we look at Scandinavia, quotas have been very helpful. I mean, they can be abolished when there's more of a level playing field, but I think to jumpstart and disrupt these network dynamics that create these basically a skewed system, these imbalances, I think it's necessary. And then the aforementioned incentives like investor pressure, shareholder pressure, pressure from the board can be helpful. In my own professional environment, I hear more in the context of sustainable investing, which has become very fashionable and a marketing tool. And that also includes diversity and hiring more women. I think the media does a very important, invaluable job bringing many of these things to the forefront, also highlighting, for instance, lawsuits, and we've seen in big banks. I mean, there have been some big ones recently. They usually get quelched with a lot of money because it's better to pay women off than for details to come to the surface. And I think societal pressure, naming and shaming, as I said, the zeitgeist has to change. And I think we need to continuously educate and train everybody, not just managers in companies. And just coincidentally, or maybe not so much, Microsoft has been in the headlines again because there was one woman who, on an inter-company email system, posed her frustration and said, you know, I've been in this job for 6 years and I've not made any headway and I feel totally stuck. What should I do? And 600 women within Microsoft responded to that. And then, of course, it eventually leaked to the press. And then Satya Nadella, who I mentioned in the beginning, had to come to address this issue. So I think that there still is a lot that needs to be done, but like I said before, we're all nodes in this network and we all need to try and exert pressure and change the zeitgeist. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, thank you both very, very much for those very interesting, provocative, and frank comments. You know, Patricia, you did not have much chance to speak to what you think the solutions are, and I think Sandra has outlined quite a few very important points of intervention and approaches. I wonder if you'd like to share a few thoughts also.
Yeah, it was. I would like to make 2 points, and then you're right, I did not make many solutions. The first one is the one that I said in my final remarks, which is access to finance. Since access to finance is one of the most key drivers in order to go for leadership in business, probably some public policy type of access to finance to startups, like is happening in Mexico and many other countries, could provide a more level playing field for women. And the other one is education that you mentioned. I have noticed in my investments and around the entrepreneurial world in Mexico that women, we don't believe our own achievements. Self-confidence is important. And there is a correlation between how secure, how sure you are that you are going to succeed vis-a-vis as a woman that you jump into entrepreneurship. Entrepreneurship is definitely one solution for the problems that we have in Mexico, like, for example, in terms of employment generation. But if women do not believe that they can do it, and that has to be started from the educational level, they will not do it. They think they don't deserve it. It's something educationally oriented.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Please. Can I respond to that? And that goes to the point as to how little progress we've actually made in terms of access to finance, where an area where the lack of network or access to networks is particularly pronounced is in venture capital. And that's very discouraging because that's a very young industry. So those are younger guys who've grown up with mothers and sisters who've been professionals, and their discrimination is abound, and their networks are particularly important. And with regard to education, because I'm working on my next book, and that is based on the changing nature of work. And when we look at digitization, it's a bit scary because I don't see a Robogeddon scenario, but a lot of the jobs that will be lost are jobs that are held by women. And then in terms of digitization, they're going to be incorporated digital biases that also work against women. So I don't think this is a fight that can be won. This is a continuous fight.
Yeah, thank you. I've served on a number of corporate boards, and at the board level, found that in the boardroom, there's really, some serious conversations around the advancement of women and attention to how many women are in the system, what are the obstacles, and I'm coming to increasingly feel, as you do, that there's, women who step out of the workforce because of children and so forth, it really doesn't explain the situation because they keep working. They just don't stay in many of the settings that they start with because of this mentoring dimension. Now, there have been different interventions around this. I remember Indra Nooyi saying, that the women at Pepsi were having difficulty getting the kind of global corporate on-the-ground management experience that men were, because they were less mobile. It was harder for them because they had other responsibilities. So she was creating short-term responsibilities around the world. So a woman could demonstrate her management capabilities with, 3 months here or 6 months here instead of 2 years here and so on. That could accommodate, different life responsibilities. So there are corporate strategies that could be developed, I guess, I'm trying to illustrate, to give women the kind of visibility around leadership as they ascend to deal with some of these issues. Have you thought of the kinds of interventions that could make a difference? Are you seeing experimentation of the sort that I just mentioned by Indra Nooyi, or do you feel like these are corner cases, these rarely are occurring?
No, I
Start with you.
Go ahead.
Yeah.
Well, I wouldn't say solutions aren't immediately obvious because they're not simple. You see hierarchies that have built over time and that become very encrusted and inflexible. So I think proactive, inventive, imaginative measures, such as those suggested by Indra Nooyi, are important. And I think it's also important for men to champion women's causes, not just women. I think women are more naturally inclined, but I think here we come to transparency and naming and shaming, but also on the other hand, assigning credit to women, to men who champion women's causes.
Mm-hmm.
Well, it was mentioned here the issue of quotas and corporate strategies to include women, and sometimes I feel very, very uncomfortable with this because I would like to know that I was invited to a board or I was invited to a position because of my achievements and my knowledge, not because I'm a woman. I was recently invited to a board at international level. I said, because we need more women for our quotas, and I had to say no. I think that the idea that was presented in the first presentation in terms of women being mentored by women in probably at a social media scale and stuff like that, it's an avenue that I would like to explore more, and you also mentioned it, because we know that women are very good at mentoring, and mentoring other women is very inspirational. And it's very effective, I have noticed. So probably if we tend more, if those who, like myself or yourself, have achieved through struggling and stuff, some more visible positions in order to be able to inspire others and share our experiences, that could be a very nice avenue to keep going in terms, rather than trying to fight for corporates to have policies more oriented towards women in higher positions.
Mm-hmm. Could I just say that if I were offered a board seat because the company needed women, I would totally accept it if I were qualified for it, because there's so many instances where I missed out on an opportunity that I think it's perfectly fine. And then also I think we need to get to the level where we have a more level playing field. If we look at the company Volkswagen, the German car maker, which is, there's a big scandal around diesel and fraud and deception on a scale that is unprecedented and Germans didn't think was possible. Managers in this company said there was a culture of fear. They didn't dare speak up. It was like an autocracy. And if I imagine myself on a board that consists primarily of men with this tone which is quite common in the financial world, I have myself observed, this very testosterone-driven, aggressive kind of tone. I think it's hard for women, and that's why many of them decide to leave that world.
Well, thank you very much. I think these are very interesting, provocative, in a way, comments. I wonder if I could ask you both a hard question that I'm grappling with. I mean, on the one hand, I think this Me Too movement has been fantastic to reveal the depth of issues and how widespread and the importance of addressing them. On the other, I sometimes worry that it creates more tensions in the workplace that make certain kinds of interactions that we must make natural, less natural. So. But on balance, I think it's a good thing. But I wonder if each of you have a view about how it's affecting the workplace.
I had a very beautiful talk yesterday with another woman, and she was saying to me that we went far to the opposite direction that we really wanted to be. That we exaggerated all these Me Too things in terms of being more like scary to men, and that we need to correct now. I mean, probably, it is a good opportunity to think how to use our feminine parts in the work arena rather than being too aggressive, too defensive, too offended. I have found that early on in my career, to try to behave like a woman, like a man, using the suits and power suits and be very aggressive, was frightening to the male world, and it was even an impediment to advance in my career because I was not listened. I was feared by them. And embracing my femininity and my feminine traits as a carer, a more team maker, opened more possibilities for me rather than being defensive and saying I was offended by this, or I was offended by that. There is a keynote speaker today that I have the opportunity and luck to be very close to, which is Ifigenia Martinez from Mexico. She's a senator 3 times. Her career is impressive. And she and I share the same thing. I have never been subject to type of harassment from men in my career. Never. Not even like a look. And Ifigenia says exactly the same, shares with me that view, like to really say, me too. I mean, I will never be able to say something like that. Probably I'm an exception, but probably also our fellow women would like to get noticed by Me Too, that is becoming extremely dangerous, I think, for women themselves.
Well, I think it has been good for women, and it has been bad for women at the same time. I actually have a subchapter in my book, specifically focused on the financial industry, which I know best. Sexual harassment has been outrageous. The Financial Times and others have done surveys, and 50% of women reported to have been subjected to some sort of harassment at some point in their careers. So I think this is just one area also where we need to change the zeitgeist. This is not acceptable anymore. On the other hand, of course, it makes men more reluctant to get into trouble, and even women. But this is a fundamental problem that it's just in the nature of men and women working together. There's no perfect solution.
Yes, that's right. So I think we have a few minutes for some questions, if you don't mind,
Sure.
and comments from our audience. And we have a microphone here, so may I invite the first, please, to come up, and if you would tell us who you are too.
Is it working? Yeah. Hi, my name is Laura, and I'm a Columbia SIPA graduate now in May. Thank you very much for the panel. I'm German as well, actually. And I thought your presentation was very insightful, and I've worked in consulting before, so maybe just 2 comments from a young woman's perspective. And I can just say amen to all that. I've literally experienced everything of like fearing to be ambitious, of like wondering if I should cut my hair, what I should wear, how I should be feminine. So it's a very emotional topic for, I think, every one of us here. Also to the naming and shaming, I've had the exact same experience where talking to my boss, he's male, and where he actually said that he's just becoming more and more uncomfortable hanging out or talking to me because of all that talk. So just yeah, from a young woman's perspective. And then maybe a question also, because you talked a lot about mentorship. I think there are a lot of students here too, and we're getting into this whole networking area. What are the 3 key recommendations for a young woman being successful now in entering the whole networking arena?
Well, as I said before, I think that the most important part is that believe that you are a very capable individual in the work arena. I mean, for some reason, probably it's a family way they raise us is that we don't deserve as much. And for me, it has been a very difficult part to cross, to really believe it. And probably to have self-confidence is one of the things that I really would like to mentor on you.
I think that women should embrace a holistic networking attitude, and then also research has shown that women are more reluctant to use relationships opportunistically for professional purposes, and I think that's something we just have to get over. Regarding mentorship, I think mentorship is overrated. That's a total luxury to have had a mentor. This is not something we can rely on. Work is getting more short-term. There's greater turnover. We see everything is going towards outsourcing. Google has already outsourced 50% of its jobs, so managers are in their positions for shorter amounts of time, so they have less incentive to mentor young people when they're going to move jobs anyway. So this is something, I think you should be your own mentor. There are so many sources that we can educate ourselves from, and just get out of your comfort zone and keep pushing yourself. And people think I'm so great at networking. I'm not good at it. I have to push myself all the time too.
Thank you very much.
I just would like to make just one addition to make it a little bit more difficult for you to take decisions on that. For me, the reason why I have been able to succeed is mentorship. Probably there is a very early relationship between girls and their parents that really can lead to some power of mentors in my life that have led me to understand how they think as males and therefore to be more confident in their world. One of them being here in front of me, Ned, has been my mentor for so many years here at Columbia University. He doesn't even remember that, but for me it was like how he behaved, how he mentored me. It has been key for my development.
Just to be sure, I'm totally in favor of mentorship, but I think it's a luxury if you can get it hands-on, but you can't rely on it.
It's not.
Thank you. We have another question or comment.
Hi, Raquel Fernandez. I'm a professor of economics at NYU, and I'll be on the next panel, but I wanted to be greedy and ask a question while I'm here. So I think women are of all types. I don't think that there is a definition of being feminine or not feminine. But I do think that there are pretty well accepted definitions of being egocentric or being arrogant. How do we succeed, this is a question to both of you, without actually becoming what we dislike? I don't love over self-confident men. I really don't like arrogant men. That's not what I want to see in, say, my female professors, who are my colleagues. How do we manage that and yet at the same time succeed? Okay.
Well, I don't think it's a solution for women to become like men because, like I said in the beginning, qualities that are admired in men are loathed in women. So to try and become one of the boys rarely helps, I think. And then in terms of how should we network, how should we project ourselves, I think it very much depends on the environment. Is it a more progressive, creative field? Is it a more conservative field? It depends. And so I think for women, there are fewer boilerplate answers than there are for men. We have to see on an individual basis, and it's a trial and error.
Mm-hmm. Well, as I said before, just the same way I try to be understood by the male world in my gender traits as being more motherly, whatever. What works for me is basically to try to understand also their gender points of view and just not take them too seriously in terms of things that I dislike. To be more empathic. I mean, to be a man, to be a male in the corporate world is also very, very scary. And sometimes attitudes of self-reliance and aggressiveness is basically also to try to be secure of where you're standing, and to be empathic on that particular aspect probably has worked for me.
Well, let me say, we have two other people. I'd like to hear from them. My own observation is that humility and leadership are rare combinations, particularly in, I think, in U.S. business culture, but they always stand out as being remarkable when they reveal themselves, I think. And so to me, it's something to applaud when we see people of great accomplishment and a degree of humility. May I invite these two last questions and then let you both comment, please.
Sure. My name is Negar Bai. I'm with the Baha'is of the United States. And I actually had a related follow-up question, which you've actually signaled to in your comments, which is you've spoken a little about the individual path, individual traits that lead to success. And so the question that was asked about how do these other qualities or values come to be central, my question is more structural or systemic, and whether the inclusion, if it just becomes women represented, women in effect being plugged into the existing system, is adequate enough. Is there any vision or understanding of how women's greater participation could transform the culture and the business so that different values like humility, like collaboration, like concern for others, limiting extraction becomes possible? Do you see that happening at all, transformation beyond sort of individual success and representation?
Mm-hmm. So a question really about women's participation and how that is increasing or not and affecting, if you will, the climate in different ways. I think there was one other person to just collect.
Hi, my name's Dawn. I actually work in inclusion. You both mentioned that you actually do support mentorship to varying degrees. I personally don't have a mentor, but firmly believe in it. I'm wondering if you can each state 3 things that you value about mentorship.
Well, we have one person who has valued but not put too much weight on it, another one who has emphasized, but let me give you each
thank you.
30 seconds to answer each
30
of
seconds.
these comments.
Okay.
I'm just gonna sit down.
Definitely the idea of women becoming more represented in the entrepreneurship arena and in the labor market will balance the tip between the traits that are needed for leadership. Definitely. As I told you before, I believe that the fact that women are participating in the slow growth industries or it's because they like to mentor, they like to mother, they like to be more embracing, and therefore these type of values are going to definitely balance the values for society in general. And in terms of mentorship, it's basically the idea of the original thing that you see to like your father, at least that was my case, and to like somebody else, that you allow yourself to be led in values that in my case have been all masculine and made me understand better how men feel comfortable on an equalizing basis working with me. That's the most valuable part in mentorship that I have found.
Thank you.
Okay, with regard to the 3 things, the mentorship, I would think ideally a mentor, especially if you're at a younger age, sees things in you that you may not even be aware of and helps you realize your potential. And I think second and thirdly, it's very important that a mentor can create access for you, can provide access that you otherwise wouldn't have had to people, to information, to opportunities. With regard to the first question and women's participation and a vision, I think that we're seeing 2 big trends still, globalization and technology, and that creates more opportunities for women at an entry level. Like billions of people are continue to come online, and we're seeing, Young spoke about it in the beginning, we see do-it-yourself globalization on platforms like Alibaba, so that's all very encouraging. On the other hand, network dynamics like the superstar economy lead to self-perpetuating homogeneity at the top, so that's a trend that goes against women, so that's why I said this is a fight that cannot be one that we need to continue to fight every day.
I would just add to that a sense that mentors should be very frank to their mentees about improvement areas. You know, that's how women succeed, when they can correct their areas of weakness and show their excellence. So let's not forget candor and tough talk. Well, I hope we've started the morning well for all of you. I know I'm grateful to our distinguished guests. Please join me in thanking them.